Hello and welcome to the latest NSF webinar for Good Clinical Practice in Pharmacovigilance. My name is Lynn Byers and I'm an Executive Director at NSF. I'm currently on holiday, so this webinar is pre-recorded. If you have any questions, please email them through and I will answer them on my return. Today's webinar is about GCP and pharmacovigilance. NSF is well known for its work in the GMP and good distribution practice fields, but we also have some associates who are experienced in good clinical practice and pharmacovigilance. So I'm a chemist by training and eligible to be a qualified person and have spent 40 years in the pharmaceutical industry, mostly in the GMP area, but I've also been responsible for leading the MHRA inspectorate for all the GXPs, plus leading the Novartis country QA organisation, where the QA staff in the country affiliates have GXP responsibilities. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about some of the differences when QPs are releasing investigational medicinal products compared with releasing commercial products, and some of the points to watch related to pharmacovigilance. So first I'm going to look at certifying products for release and use within clinical trials. These need to be performed by a qualified person. A clinical trial is intended to assess the product being investigated against the existing treatment standard, a so-called comparator. The Declaration of Helsinki only permits the use of placebos in specific circumstances. So the QP is releasing two products for a clinical trial, and this is very different compared to releasing a commercial product. The level of knowledge the QP has is also different, particularly for the comparator product. A comparator is generally a product manufactured by another company and will have been purchased by the organisation performing the clinical trial. So how does the QP know that the comparator has been manufactured according to GMP? The advice is that ideally the comparator should be approved by an EU member state or by an ICH member country. This gives a level of assurance that the product meets GMP EU requirements or equivalent. So the first important point for the QP is to have information about the source of the comparator and in which markets it's approved. If the comparator product is a placebo, then the company running the trial will typically manufacture the placebo or have it manufactured for them. So there is good in-house knowledge of the GMP applied to the manufacture of the placebo. Release of an IMP is a two-step process. There needs to be regulatory approval that the clinical trial application is approved, so the sponsor of the trial needs to give regulatory release and the QP needs to certify the IMP. Both releases need to be included in the clinical trial master file. The sponsor regulatory approval needs to ensure that all aspects required for compliance with the regulations are in place before the IMP is shipped to the investigator site. Examples of the requirements include ensuring that contracts are in place with the investigators and applicable service providers, that local and national approvals are in place, for example, ethics committee approvals. Decoding arrangements are in place, and in particular having emergency unblinding arrangements in place. So I've talked about releasing product to a clinical trial, but what is equally important is to have a plan in place to recall investigational medicinal products. The need to recall comparators is an added dimension to the clinical trial process. Make sure you have arrangements in place with the vendor of the comparator related to the recall. So, moving to pharmacovigilance. The purpose of pharmacovigilance is to monitor the safety of the medicinal product and to detect any changes to their risk-benefit balance. Pharmacovigilance applies across the whole of the product life cycle, from phase 1 clinical trials until the product is withdrawn from the market. Companies need to have a pharmacovigilance system in place and a QP for pharmacovigilance within the EU or the EEA. I'm not going to talk in detail about the pharmacovigilance system, but more about the interfaces between the pharmacovigilance system and the pharmaceutical quality system. The closest interface between the PV and the PQS is the product technical complaints and adverse event systems. In both of the systems, it is necessary to have a process in place to determine if a complaint should be listed in the PV system and vice versa. For example, a nil effect complaint needs to be thoroughly investigated in the manufacturing area, but equally it could be a lack of clinical effect in certain patient populations, and therefore it is necessary for the medical function to keep a note of such events. A nil effect notification could come into either system, either complaints or the pharmacovigilance system. And there is a need to be a reconciliation process to ensure that nothing is lost and that there has been confirmation that an adverse event, which was initially received as a technical complaint, has been raised in the pharmacovigilance system and vice versa. There are also specific timelines for reporting the various categories of adverse events. For example, serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reactions must be reported in 7 days. As with other areas of GXP, agreements need to be in place with the various actors within the supply chain or with other companies acting on behalf of the marketing authorization holder. One example is distributors who may act on behalf of the marketing authorization holder in certain territories. In addition to a contract, a technical agreement, it is also important to have a pharmacovigilance agreement with the formally approved agreements between the companies. The agreement should provide clarity on what the distributor needs to do if an adverse event is reported to them, and the timelines in which the adverse event should be reported. Other areas which are not immediately obvious as potentially containing adverse events or other items linked to the pharmacovigilance system are items such as websites or apps or social media. Whenever a patient or a healthcare practitioner could leave feedback is a place where an adverse event could be reported. The design of such systems is critical. If there is an opportunity to leave comments, then the websites or apps need to be monitored. Sales and marketing staff interact routinely with healthcare practitioners, and they could receive notification of potential adverse events. In some markets, it's mandatory to ask specific questions when a product has just been launched, for example in Japan. Therefore, the possibility of being verbally informed of adverse events is high when this happens. In addition, don't forget conferences where healthcare practitioners meet with company personnel. Sales and marketing staff receive regular training in pharmacovigilance requirements, but it is very important that they fully understand what must be reported. There is a regulatory requirement that all personnel who may receive adverse events receive initial and continued training in pharmacovigilance. Some companies have annual mandated training for all staff. In this webinar, I've talked about 2 key roles within the pharmaceutical industry. the GMP QP and the QP for pharmacovigilance. The QP PV needs to be permanently and continuously at the disposal of the marketing authorization holder and to regulatory authorities on a 24/7 basis. So when the QP PV goes on holiday, there need to be arrangements to provide cover. Regulators often check if they can contact the QP PV by calling the number they have for them out of hours. For the PV system, only one QP PV is named. However, member states may allow a national pharmacovigilance contact person. It is also not mandatory for the QP PV to be medically qualified. However, if they're not medically qualified, then they need to be assisted by medically trained personnel. Let's think about how good clinical practice and pharmacovigilance may influence a company's pharmaceutical quality system. Many of the requirements for GMP, good distribution practice, good clinical practice, and pharmacovigilance are similar, but there are also some differences. A strategic question a company needs to answer when setting up its pharmaceutical quality system is whether the system will be GXP or maybe whether the company will have two systems, one for manufacturing and supply chain and one for research and development. Either option can work, but if you're developing a GXP PQS, then it's important to ensure the definitions that are developed for keywords are very clear in the relevant GXPs. For example, deviation, incident, and similar words mean slightly different things in the different GXP worlds. If a company has decided to have two pharmaceutical quality systems, certain interfaces need to be clear and the link between the systems. For example, the product's technical complaints and the pharmacovigilance system, or the technology transfer processes between R&D and manufacturing, to name but a few. What must not happen is that parts of the business develop their own pharmaceutical quality system without consulting with one another. At NSF, we often see pharmaceutical quality systems which have grown over the years and become more complicated and therefore more difficult to comply with. Sometimes we're asked by proactive companies to help them redefine their PQS. Following a merger or a demerger, it's often a good time to take stock and to take the opportunity for a radical rethink. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this webinar and have learned one or two new things. This is just a taster about two areas of the GXP, which are important for GMP and good distribution practice experts. If you'd like to learn more, then might I suggest two one-day workshops which have been held in October in Watford. They're led by an ex-MHRA inspector, Louise Moore, who's very experienced in the field of good clinical practice and pharmacovigilance. And the details are shown on screen here. In addition, I want to also mention that NSF now have launched a series of e-learnings. The first available topics include basic microbiology, GMP for engineers, GXP inspection management lifecycle, self-inspections, and also a regulatory update which includes information about the clinical trial regulations. If you have any questions, please email me and I will get back to you. And if we can be of any further service to you, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you for listening and have a good day. Thank you. Goodbye.